Hello again, everyone. All right, in this video, we're going to go ahead and set up our player, and we're going to get player sprite into the game. We're going to set them up so that they can fly around the screen. So first thing we're going to do is take in the project we had previously worked with. We'll go back here to the Assets folder in the project window, and we're going to add a few more folders. We're going to add one for prefabs, sprites, and though we're not going to need this for a while, animations. Now let's go ahead and open up our sprites folder. Sprites are 2D images. Now you have what's called a sprite sheet. Those of you unfamiliar with a sprite sheets look like this. Series of images that make up the different animation frames of an individual 2D image. So you have something like our ship here. These two frames, the difference is the flames at the back of the ship. They are flickering as the ship is supposed to be moving. And then these other images are as the ship banks right and as the ship banks left. And each column has 2 frames to it. We're going to go ahead and import to our Unity project the ship, and we're also going to import the laser bolts. So we're going to need those not too much longer from now. All right, so if you select the ship here in the Assets window, you can see that when you expand it to see all the different frames, it sees the ship image as just one giant frame. It doesn't have any understanding that it's a sprite sheet. You need to go ahead and tell it that that's what you're working with here. So if we select the ship, over here in the inspector window on the right, we're going to change the sprite mode from single to multiple, and the filter mode from bilinear to point. And then we're going to apply this change. This should give us the ability to open up our Sprite Editor. And this is where it's going to show us, again, the single giant image. If you expand this window so we can see the menu options, you'll see along the top here there's a slice option. If you click it, you can slice a sprite 3 ways. Automatically, let it just hopefully guess what's going on. Grid by cell size, where we're going to tell it, and we've got X by Y, and it's going to repeat that X by Y size starting at the top left, going across and then down and across until it runs out of space. Or we could say grid by cell count. We know that each of these frames are the same size. So we can go ahead and just break this up by the number of columns we have, which is 5, and the number of rows, which is 2. And then you click Slice. The rest of the options aren't really important right now. Now once we have sliced it, you can kind of see there's some white line showing you exactly what it sliced up the image into. Go ahead and click the Apply, and we now have our individual frames. If we close this window and look down here, you'll see that the ship has been split up into its individual frames. So let's go ahead and get the ship into the actual game now. Back up here in the hierarchy, right-click, go to 2D Object, Sprite. We're adding a 2D sprite object to the game. In the inspector, we're going to change its name to Player. We're going to make sure that the transform position X, Y, and Z are all zeroed out. We want it to be in the middle of our game screen starting out. Now, the Sprite Renderer is a component that allows us to take a sprite image and render it to the screen. This was actually what will cause the image to show up. This is how Unity knows that we're going to give it a sprite image. You need to draw it to the screen. This image or this object has the properties of a sprite. We're going to use sprite in the sprite window here. We're going to use ship2. This is the image of our ship that's just flying straight ahead. Later on, we'll come back and we'll set these up to be animated, but for now, we just want our standard ship image that looks like it's from the top down flying straight ahead. Okay, so you take that again, you drag it from here and drop it in the sprite renderer on the sprite row. Now, if we go ahead and select our camera, you can see it's really, really tiny. So we're going to make an adjustment to our camera to better fit the size of our sprites. With the camera selected in the hierarchy, go ahead and where it says size, set that from 5 to 1. And now we can go ahead and zoom in on our window here. Once you're able to zoom in, the giant camera image that you see will disappear because we're now close enough to the camera that the editor assumes we know where the camera is. And you can see our ship image sitting right there. This right here is our player. Our player has the ship image on it. That's how it displays. Now, we've got to go ahead now and do two different things. First, we're going to add a component to the player. We're going to add something called a Rigidbody 2D. Yeah? It's a 2D game, so we want to use the 2D Rigidbody. And we want to use a Rigidbody because rigid bodies are essentially what give objects in Unity access to physics. It's what allows them to have things like drag, gravity, collision. Because this is a space game, and the way that we're going to set up our game later on, the defaults for the Rigidbody 2D are fine. However, for gravity scale right here, we want to change that to 0. We don't want there to be any gravity in space. At least, not that's going to affect our ship. All right. Finally, let's go over to the scripts asset folder. Let's right-click, create C# script, and we're going to name it player controller. Naming it this way so that it matches the objects that we are creating. The player _controller matches to the player. I'm going to drag the player script and drop it on the player in the hierarchy. At least I will as soon as Unity catches up. There we go. Let's make sure it didn't add it for me. No. So let's drag player controller and drop it on the player. And now you see over here in the inspector, when I have player selected, there's the script. Let's go ahead and double click and open the script. You can double click here, or on the player you can double click in the inspector the name of the script. And this will open up Visual Studio. Zoom in a little here. All right. Now we briefly went over the scripts in when we were looking at the camera script here. But just to repeat, the main things you want to know is that a script to have access to the Unity functions needs to have using Unity engine. And all objects that you create in code that need to have access to Unity features need to inherit from monobehavior. You can get into the details of this if you want. You just need to understand that any object that you want to have as a game object within Unity should inherit from monobehavior to have access to all of the features, such as its own rigid body and all the other objects that are in the scene, things like that. We have our player controller. Now, our start method, this method goes ahead and is called the moment an object comes into existence in a scene. So in our game, when we click play, the moment the player object comes into existence is created, the start method is called. You saw this when we looked at the camera script. The update method is called once per frame. So every single time our game is drawn to the screen for our computer, okay, it's going to go ahead and call the update method. This is related to things like your frame rate. So if it's your frame rate for your computer is at 60 frames per second right now, it's going to call update 60 times per second. All right. Now, what we need to do, we have a spaceship. That spaceship needs to move, so we need to give it a speed. I'm going to put it as a float so we can set that number granularly, not just 1, 2, 3, but give fractional amounts. And then we need to be able to encode, access the Rigidbody 2D that we've attached to this object. So we're going to need a variable before we do that. So we've got a public float speed and a private Rigidbody 2D called RB. Go ahead and save your script and go back to Unity. Now with the player selected, you're going to see in the inspector down at the player script that speed has now become an input field. That matches the public float speed we've created. It sees speed, It sees it as one word, it knows to go ahead and capitalize it, and it makes it an input field that takes in a float, so it defaults to 0. We're going to set this to 1. Now you'll notice the rigid body field isn't here, and that's because it's set as private in code. So therefore, it's not going to show up as a field you can manipulate within the Unity editor. So let's go ahead and save this scene, go back to our code. Now, when the ship comes into existence, the first thing we want to do is make sure that it goes ahead and gets the rigid body 2D component and assigns it to the RB value, so that now in code, in this script, RB has access to the player's rigid body 2D component. When we added a component, this is a component, it is a rigid body 2D, it is on the player. In order to access this component in code, we need a variable, and we then need to get the component and assign it to that variable. Now, let's go ahead and we're going to make our ship actually move. So, below the update method, let's go ahead and add a new method called move. And Visual Studio there tries to help you out, which is sometimes not helpful. So, in our move method, we want to go ahead and gain access to see what the user is pressing on the keyboard. So we're going to access the input interface object. The input is a globally accessible object that you can go ahead and use to check to see what the user is pressing in the keyboard, the mouse, a controller, all the different inputs. And we're going to use getAccessRaw. getAccessRaw, as you can see, returns the value of the virtual axis based upon the name, with no smoothing filtering applied. What that means is it's going to get the actual raw value that is coming from the input. It's not going to go ahead and try to adjust it or clean it up or round the value. So we're going to have input getAccessRaw, and then from the input object, we're going to say, look for any of the horizontal inputs. And that would be something like A or D on your keyboard, or the left and right arrow keys. For Y, we're going to do the same thing, getAccessRaw. However, Y is vertical, so we're going to be looking at the vertical inputs, up, down arrow, W, and S. So once we have the value of whether or not they have pressed it, and you should understand here, getAccessRaw, horizontal and vertical, is looking to see whether or not you are engaging the inputs for the horizontal and vertical inputs. On a keyboard, you either are pressing a key or you're not. So this value will return 0 or 1, or -1. 0 means you're not pressing it. In the case of vertical, if you're pressing up or W, that's 1. If you're pressing down or S, that's -1. Now, if you have a remote or a controller, such as an Xbox controller plugged in, and you just slightly press the joystick up or down, you're going to get a granular value back, somewhere between -1 and 1, and it could be a fraction. But with a keyboard, you're going to just get basically yes or no, it's being pressed, and 1 is up, negative is down. Now we're going to go ahead and find out how much we're moving the player. And we're going to take whatever the X input is, and we're going to multiply that by the speed. The X input will tell us whether we're moving left or right, just as Y will tell us we're moving up or down, because we're going to get the 1 or -1. And the speed is the value that we went ahead and set that can be inputted right here inside of Unity. And from there, we're going to go ahead and reference that rigid body that we have attached to the player object, and we're going to set its velocity. Now, because it's a 2D game, velocity is in 2D space, so we use a vector 2, and then we pass in the move X and move Y that we just calculated. And the last thing we have to do is back here in the update method, go ahead and add a call to the move function. So now it's going to repeatedly, every frame, check to see has the user gone ahead and started pressing up, down, left, right. Save your script. Go back to Unity. You may see it take a little bit as it updates everything. Yep, there we go. And let's go ahead and run our game. And you should now be able to move the player around the screen using ASDW or the left, right, up, down arrow keys. And that concludes this video.